How Julio Iglesias conquered America when nobody wanted Latin music. They told him no. Over and over and over again. No. 1976, New York City. Julio Iglesias sat in another sterile office, another American record executive leaning back in his leather chair with that same apologetic smile. Look, you're huge in Europe, I get it. But Spanish music? In America? It's never going to work. Americans don't listen to songs they can't understand. It was the 17th rejection that year. 17 times he'd been told the American dream didn't include him. But Julio wasn't listening anymore. He was planning. The numbers were brutal. In 1976, America was the world's largest music market, $2.7 billion in annual sales. But Latin music? Less than 1% market share. The last Spanish-language artist to crack the Billboard Top 40 was Trini Lopez in 1963, 13 years earlier, with If I Had a Hammer, and even that was in English. The industry had its reasons. Radio stations claimed their audiences didn't want it. MTV, when it launched in 1981, would famously refuse to play Latin artists. Even record stores didn't know where to shelve Spanish albums. World music? International? Ethnic? The categorization itself was a rejection. They looked at me like I was asking them to sell ice to Eskimos, Julio said years later. To them, Spanish was a barrier. To me, it was just another language for saying what everyone understands: love, pain, longing. But here's what nobody understood: Julio Iglesias wasn't just a singer. He was a strategist. Step 1: learn the enemy's language. While recording his 9th Spanish album in 1978, Julio hired English tutors. Not to perfect his accent, that would come later, but to understand American culture, American humor, American timing. He watched Johnny Carson religiously. He studied Frank Sinatra's phrasing. He memorized Beatles lyrics not to sing them, but to understand why they worked. His English was rough, accented, imperfect. And that, he realized, might be his weapon. Step 2: find the crack in the wall. 1979, Miami. The Cuban exile community had transformed South Florida into something unprecedented: a bilingual market with American buying power. Julio performed at the Fontainebleau, the Doral, intimate venues where Cuban grandmothers wept at his ballads and their American-born grandchildren nodded along, not understanding the words but feeling everything. CBS Records' Miami office noticed. Sales in Florida were anomalous. His albums were moving in record stores that catered to Latin communities. Not huge numbers, but consistent. Persistent. Proof that someone in America was listening. Step 3: the Trojan Horse. 1981, Julio's manager, a brilliant, relentless man named Alfredo Freile, had an idea that seemed insane: record an album in English. Not perfect English. Not trying to be American. But English nonetheless. The label executives were skeptical. You can barely speak English, one told him bluntly. Why would Americans buy an album they can barely understand? Julio smiled. Because Frank Sinatra can't sing in Spanish. The logic was strange but sound. He'd be offering Americans something Sinatra couldn't: romance in an accent, sophistication with mystery, familiar emotions in an unfamiliar voice. It was positioning, not pandering. But there was a problem. Solo albums by foreign artists singing in English had a near-perfect failure rate. Americans wanted authenticity, or they wanted America. Julio was neither. So Alfredo proposed something radical: a duet. With an American legend. Enter Willie Nelson. 1984, country music and Latin ballads had nothing in common. Willie Nelson, the red-headed stranger with the bandana and the beat-up guitar, and Julio Iglesias seemed like a cosmic joke. One sang about Texas honky-tonks, the other about Mediterranean heartbreak. One wore braids and denim, the other wore silk suits and cologne. But both understood loneliness. Both understood what it meant to sing to strangers about private pain. To All the Girls I've Loved Before was written by Hal David and Albert Hammond, two Jewish songwriters, one American, one British Gibraltarian. The song had been rejected by multiple artists. It was too sentimental, too old-fashioned for the synthesizer-heavy 1980s. But Julio heard something else. He heard a bridge between two audiences who'd never spoken to each other. The recording session in Los Angeles was awkward at first. Willie showed up in his tour bus, smelling of the road. Julio arrived in a limousine, tailored and nervous. They sang their parts separately, Willie's weathered drawl, Julio's accented croon. The producer wasn't sure it would work. Then they heard the playback. Willie's voice, American, familiar, safe, opened the door. And Julio's voice, exotic and yearning, walked through it. The blend shouldn't have worked. But it did. Because both men were singing about the same thing: memory, gratitude, loss. CBS Records was cautiously optimistic. They pressed a modest first run. Radio stations filed it under country because of Willie. Then under easy listening because of Julio. Then under pop because it was climbing charts they couldn't explain. April 1984. To All the Girls I've Loved Before hit number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100. In the country charts, it went to number 1. Julio Iglesias, The Man America Didn't Want, was suddenly unavoidable. The song played at weddings, at proms, in grocery stores and elevators. Americans were singing along to Julio's heavily accented English and they didn't care. They were crying to it. The strategy had worked. Willie Nelson was the permission slip. His credibility transferred to Julio. And once America heard Julio's voice, really heard it, they wanted more. But Julio didn't stop there. The follow-up album, 1100, Bel Air Place, was a masterclass in American penetration. He recorded duets with Diana Ross, the Beach Boys, Dolly Parton, Stevie Wonder. Each collaboration was strategic. Ross gave him R&B credibility, the Beach Boys gave him California cool, Parton gave him country depth, Wonder gave him soul legitimacy. He wasn't trying to be American. He was proving he belonged in the American conversation. Madison Square Garden. October 1984. Julio Iglesias sold out the most iconic venue in America. Not the Spanish-language community in the Bronx. All of New York. Stockbrokers and secretaries, cab drivers and CEOs. They came for the voice that had slipped past every barrier the industry had erected. He opened with, To All the Girls I've Loved Before. 20,000 people sang along badly, with the wrong accents, stumbling over lyrics they'd memorized phonetically. It didn't matter. For 3 minutes, Madison Square Garden sang in broken English and perfect emotion. Backstage afterward, Julio called his father in Madrid. Dr. Iglesias, who'd wanted his son to be a physician, who'd worried about this singing career, answered on the second ring. Papa, Julio said, his voice shaking. They said yes. America finally said yes. By 1985, Julio Iglesias had sold more albums than any other Latin artist in history. By 1990, he held the Guinness World Record for best-selling male Latin artist. By 2000, he'd recorded in 14 languages and sold over 300 million albums worldwide. But none of it would have happened if he'd listened to that first no. Or the 17th. The lesson wasn't about talent. America had plenty of talented singers. The lesson was about strategy, understanding that barriers aren't walls, they're puzzles. Finding the crack. Building the bridge. Using Willie Nelson as that bridge, then proving he could stand alone on the other side. Today, Latin music is the fastest-growing genre in America. Bad Bunny, Rosalia, Karol G, they dominate streaming platforms. Spanish-language tracks hit number 1 on Billboard without English remixes. The barriers Julio faced seem quaint, almost impossible to believe. But they were real. And he dismantled them not with rage or protest, but with patience and strategy and one perfectly chosen duet. When asked how he did it, Julio always gave the same answer: I didn't conquer America. I just asked her to dance in a language she didn't know she understood. The office doors that slammed in 1976 now hang in museums. Julio Iglesias proved that no is just an invitation to find another door. And when you can't find one, you build it yourself. 17 Rejections. 1 Willie Nelson. 20,000 voices at Madison Square Garden singing words they barely understood but felt completely. That's how you conquer America when America doesn't want you. You make them realize they always did.